who is Antonio Wetland is responsible for maintaining the program on education policy and governance, which I direct, and a very valuable person on our staff. Our topic today is, can the federal government play a productive role in education reform? So thank you for joining us. I want to introduce our speaker, James Blue. He is currently a co-founder of an organization called the Defense of Freedom Institute, or DFI. It's an independent nonprofit education choice organization that wants to limit the federal role in education and workforce development. Previously, he served at the U.S. Department of Education under Secretary Betsy DeVos as the Assistant Secretary for Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development. Prior to that, Jim Blue worked in education reform at the state level. He was the National President of Students First and the National Director of the Alliance for School Choice. So, Jim, thank you very much for joining us today. And we're going to have some questions and answer period here later before we close at 1 o'clock Eastern time. But for now, why don't you give your thoughts on the topic of today? Can the federal government play a productive role in education reform?
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate the introduction. I think it's probably worth pulling out a couple of points from that. I've been working full-time to improve education in this country now for more than 25 years. I think there's a lot of evidence that I'm a complete failure. Millions of kids are still not being served well by our education system. You could also pull from that resume. You mentioned Betsy DeVos, but professionally I've been associated with many of the giants of education reform, starting with John Walton. Did run the Walton Family Foundation education investments for about a decade. Michelle Rhee, Howard Fuller, and of course, Betsy DeVos. I am happy later on to answer questions about any of that experience, about education reform in general. But today I really wanted to focus on something that I don't think is getting enough notice, and that is the federal role in education. And to be clear, when I say education in this talk today, I'll use a lot of statistics from K-12, but I'm really talking about everything from early childhood right through lifelong learning, post-secondary education, workforce development. I'm raising this issue because without much notice, without much comment, the federal government has dramatically increased the amount of spending it's doing in education just in the last 18 months, starting with the beginning of the pandemic. And there's much more to come in the bills that are talked about right now in Congress. So I realize that for most of this audience, your instincts around this is that you don't care where the money comes from for public education. We need more of it, so let's just get it where we can. My thesis today is that we should care and that the federal role should be as limited as possible. Let me start with a specific illustration because it's something that's part of the Build Back Better plan. Without much debate, we're on the brink of letting the feds become the dominant funder and regulator of early childhood. It's worth pausing for a moment and asking if federalizing preschool is such a great idea. You need to understand, I am a huge fan of early childhood education. I think the brain science, a lot of data is telling us that is a critical period leading to better life outcomes if done well. I'm just saying that the federal government should not be the entity in control of all of that. Some historical context might be helpful and interesting here. Paul Paul, would you just cut me off if I go on too long around the historical pieces of this? But what people need to understand is that education in America has historically been managed and funded locally. A century ago, almost all of the funding for public schools came from local taxes, particularly property taxes. That hyper-local system had some clear benefits. Local citizens knew they were paying for their community schools, and they invested accordingly and managed them quite attentively. But there was a problem with that system, and that is that because funding was based on local property taxes, and that meant that funding depended on the local tax base, it led to a lot of inequity. There was, across states, you had quite a variety of per pupil funding. That led the states to step up. And over time, they have increased their spending on K-12 education in particular, but also post-secondary. And at this point, the states' governments put about as much into K-12 education in particular as the local governments do. I could have also said state taxpayers and local taxpayers. And predictably, as states got into funding education more, and also as they became a conduit for all the federal funding, they increased their regulations and demands on local districts. Now, none of that is necessarily bad, but you can see the trade-off. As local schools relied less and less on local funding, community control of their schools drifted away. And the way I put this typically is more and more you were hearing principals explain behavior of the school by saying, well, the state makes us do it, or the feds make us do it. Excuse me just a second. For most of our history, federal funding was very limited, and the federal role regulations were very limited. And philosophically, it's not hard to argue that we should manage funds locally and fund and manage schools locally. There is a constitutional argument. I am not a lawyer, but I think most of us know that education is the purview of the states, not the federal government, and the growing federal role, as well as the bureaucracy's intuition to be a good steward of those funds, has led to federal intrusion. And you can ask anybody in the states about this. There's more and more influence from the federal government. You can argue that constitutionally, you can argue it philosophically. But when it comes to the practical and the political, it's very hard to argue that federal money should not be involved. And in fact, when local schools haven't delivered and don't appear to have the resources to do so, these are national issues, and so Congress feels compelled to get involved. And until recently, every major federal program was stood up because of a failure, often an egregious failure of the local schools. I could go through every law on the books and tell you what failure led to that law. I'm not going to take time to do it today, but of course I will in question and answer period. We need to point out, Congress does not operate in a vacuum. It is susceptible to public pressure, to lobbying pressure. And here's where I have to express grudging admiration for the NEA and AFT. They, along with dozens of other employee groups, every employee group that exists in this country is represented in DC, and other beneficiaries of federal dollars have a very sophisticated and effective lobbying operation. And they deserve much of the credit for the increases in federal spending. You can see all of the impact of this on, for example, the US Department of Education's discretionary annual budget appropriation. That is not all of the federal spending, but it's a majority of the federal spending on elementary, secondary, post-secondary education. Let me give you a couple of figures. 3 decades ago in 1989, the department's discretionary appropriation was about $17 billion. That used to be a lot of money. By 2020, that had more than tripled to $72 billion. And the Biden administration is now talking about raising it another 40%. So they were 17 billion, 72 billion more. We are looking close to 100 billion. We are looking at really a dramatic increase in the federal spending. You can see, you should also know that at the same time, local and state spending rose dramatically. A couple of figures around that. From 1970 to 2020, that 50-year period, the number of students in public education grew fairly modestly, about 15% from 45 million to 51 million. At the same time, funding skyrocketed. NCES, National Commission on Education Statistics, estimated the inflation-adjusted K-12 expenditures in 1970 at $40 billion. So you understand, today it is more than $800 billion. That's a 20-fold increase. And forgive the editorial here, let's just say it doesn't matter in today's political environment, but I can't resist noting that we have not seen a 20-fold increase in achievement outcomes of any sort. In fact, for our neediest students, the outcomes remain flat, just as they were in 1970. Because of this overall increase in education spending, the federal share of K-12 revenue is modest. In 1919, before the pandemic, last year we have reliable figures, federal taxpayers represented just 7% of the total. Yet the feds make a lot of demands in exchange for that 7%. And public school advocates would certainly make a lot of noise if you ever tried to roll that back. Now, why is federal money, it's only 7%, why is it so important to the education sector? One answer is very evident. The federal dollars are programmatically targeted at our neediest children, and those funds could make a difference in their lives. But unfortunately, that's not the complete answer. The education sector is drawn to federal dollars because they are conceptually unlimited. In contrast, states and local districts have to balance their budgets. That means that elected officials have to make trade-offs. How much will go to healthcare? How much will go to law enforcement, infrastructure, et cetera, as well as K-12 and post-secondary education? It's a very messy process, especially when you're a government labor union that's competing with funds for other unions and allies. In contrast, federal expenditures are by design, this is intentional, much less disciplined. If you can secure an appropriation, you essentially do not need to worry about matching revenue. And it's true, Congress goes through a process to identify what are called pay-fors. But at the end of the day, if the spending leads to deficits, so be it. At some point, Congress may need to raise the country's debt ceiling, which is now close to $30 trillion. But while economists and wonks might care about that, the public yawns. So the federal money is much less disciplined. And this is why AFT and NEA have been on a 60-year campaign to capture federal dollars for teacher salaries. To them, it would be ideal to, say, get a $13,000 base for every union teacher in this country, and then build on top of that with local and state revenues. So far, Congress has generally resisted letting federal dollars pay for teacher salaries, and for lots of good reasons. But there are exceptions, and they're worth noting. So in the Great Recession, state and local tax revenues dropped, and in some places they dropped precipitously. In President Obama's American Recovery and Reinvestment Act era, they explicitly included $100 billion to help pay teacher and staff salaries. This established a precedent that the federal government should step in whenever local districts are having financial hardship. That same precedent was leveraged for the 3 COVID relief bills. And together, those have now appropriated more than $200 billion to K-12 education in a 13-month period. Remember, the year before, the revenue across the entire K-12 system was just $860 billion. This $200 billion is an unprecedented flow of federal funds. So, advocates for more federal funding have a simple and compelling education. Education is a public good, and we should put as much federal money as possible into that. But there is more to their argument. If you disagree with us, we will destroy you politically, and we will brand you as a hater of teachers, children, and puppies. But that's politics. We recognize that a little arm twisting is beneficial when you're making a compelling message. In September, I'll mention this, I co-founded a new federal policy to begin making a very different argument to the policy community. The organization is called the Defense of Freedom Institute, and it's pronounced, as Paul said, DEFY. That is in keeping with my personality. To us, federal money is pretty complicated. Federal involvement has a long history of making programs more expensive, less efficient, less effective. There are cheaper and better ways to fund education. That shouldn't be an iron law, but it seems to be. One reason for this is that federal money always comes with federal demands. Those demands might be well-intentioned, but they tend to be one size fits all. Even though a single approach to our complex education challenges could not possibly work across all of America's diverse communities, much less for each of the 60+ million students who the public serves. Federal demands create friction. Sometimes they make programs essentially unworkable, and they always add to cost. In the context of education, I do have 2 deeper concerns that go way beyond wasting limited resources. The first has to do with sparking innovation, and the second has to do with holding the country together. As a reformer, I believe we need a variety of completely new school models to finally educate the students who are not well served by today's schools. To meet this need, we need to unleash entrepreneurs, educators to rethink and recreate schools. I believe that is much more likely to happen at the local level, when people have permission to experiment and innovate. The stronger the federal role, the slimmer the chances of new innovative models. I want to note some friends and reformers disagree with me on this. They imagine a DARPA for education that could successfully invest in new technology and models and put American education at the cutting edge, just as DARPA keeps our military at the cutting edge. I just want to acknowledge that is an idea worth discussing. But I want to shift gears and talk about the last issue, and this requires me to get serious about my experience in federal service. As Paul mentioned, I was Betsy DeVos's assistant secretary for policy, and that included budget. I was also part of her core leadership. We need to be leery of the awesome power of the federal government. It has been and it can be a force for good, but it also can go sideways. We need our constitutional checks and balances. We need our First Amendment freedoms, and we all need to vote. It turns out that in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, on the left and on the right, there are people who are autocratic. These are people who are so sure they have the right answer to our complex questions, issues, that they're willing to impose their answers and the consequences on everyone else. I've already alluded to the power of the federal government when we're just a 7% investor in K-12. And now, I don't want to sound too paranoid, but I am sincerely concerned that Congress is inadvertently imbuing the federal agencies with way too much power as they direct more and more funding through them. Now, concentrations of power aren't necessarily a problem as long as people act responsibility and don't abuse their positions. But here's where the autocrats come in. And unfortunately, they always do. I'm pretty sure I'm articulating a current fear of the center-right voting public. Look critically at the backlash against Terry McAuliffe for arguing that parents should not control their children's education. They seem to despise how their schools are more sensitive to the needs and demands of government and unions than to those parents. But this should also be a concern for the left, this meaning the growing power of the federal government. A right-wing autocrat could also abuse the powers of the US Department. Despite the union's long confidence that they'll always control the US Department, after all, it was created specifically for them, Betsy DeVos proved them wrong. And they could be proven wrong again, and that person could be an autocrat. In closing, let me be realistic. Congress won't likely roll back funding anytime soon. So I favor other ways to avoid federal overreach. My personal favorite, which may not be realistic in the current environment, is that the federal aid would be bundled, it would be delivered to families in the form of a digital wallet, and we could then cultivate a market of educational options for those families. One of those options would be a traditional school, by the way. They do seem to work for maybe half the kids out. Lobbying forces won't allow that sort of approach, but there are other things that are much more mainstream. And the one I'd really like to put on the table today is a no strings block grant. We can take the money in ESEA, send it out to states by formula, and then let them do what they need to educate our children. Their interests are aligned with the federal interest. We should just trust them to do that. Based on that, Paul, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, for those opening remarks. And I want to invite all of you who are with us today to put some questions into the chat or indicate in some way by raising your hand that you would like to pose a question. Let me begin by asking about special education, because that is in 1974, there were many disabled children in the United States who were excluded from going to school simply because they were disabled. My own son was one of them, I have to tell you, Jim. So when the federal government said in PL 94-142, when Congress said, and this was bipartisan, both political parties overwhelmingly passed this legislation, Gerald Ford signed it into law, we must provide education to every child, and a large program developed under it. And I know the special education law has many problems and it's not a perfect piece of legislation, but isn't this an example of the federal government playing a positive role in our education?
Absolutely. Yeah, so when I said earlier that every major federal program is the result of a local failure, this is one of the more egregious failures. Students with disabilities were largely eliminated and we're not getting educated in this country. And it's remarkable what's happened in the last 50 years. you mentioned that this is not a perfect law. There is no perfect law. And one of the unintended consequences is that it has created a cottage industry of litigation. Because parents have the right, there is now a whole lot of legal structure around making sure that students get a free and public education. It is, people will also point out that IDEA never was funded at the levels that Congress initially promised. I believe the figure was 40% of the money would come from the federal government. It's really only 20%. And people need to understand that that's partly because Congress is not obliged to reach that 40%. And they feel that the level they're providing is about right, because if you start giving too much money to it, then it creates yet more waste in the program. I think there are ways to improve IDEA. And part of that would be to empower locals, again, so what happened is IDEA sort of changed the culture, and then everyone embraced, well, of course we should have been educating our students with disabilities, and people have stepped up so that we no longer need the heavy hand of the federal government to make sure it's all happening. We can bundle that IDEA money, send it out to states, and then let them manage their own students with disabilities. Does that help, Paul?
Yes, well, that's a good clarification. Let me ask Andrew Epifanio has a question about your comments on early childhood education. Andrew, do you want to pose that question?
Sure. Yeah, I was curious about how you might envision what you might see as the future for the federal government's investment in early childhood education, particularly given that this has a place in current legislation that's being discussed.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty clear that I'm not among the people that are going to be deciding this, Andrew, so I'm happy to riff on it. This will be a push through by the Democratic majority. I suspect they won't have a single Republican vote supporting it. And the reason for that is that the model they're choosing is very federally oriented. It will be managed and regulated by the federal government. There are provisions in there that would likely remove faith-based provision of preschool, which, as you probably know, is a large base right now. And there are other things that will push the system into being just an extension of our K-12 public schools. In fact, President Biden himself just says, we're going to be adding 4 years of public school. 2 of those were at the community college level. That, I believe, has been dropped from the bill. But the 2 additional years of preschool remain. And I wish people would stop and think about how the K-12 system is performing already, particularly with low-income communities. And the idea of extending that down 2 years is, to me, actually the absolute wrong answer for how we should address early childhood education. I mentioned sort of the 2 principles at the end that I wish the federal government would follow. It's fine with me if you empower families to choose early childhood education, professional settings, or to do it at home. And if we believe in that, then let's give the families the money to let them make that choice. That's an expensive venture, but if that's what we decide to do, that's fine. The other approach would be to block grant. Again, just give the money to the states, which is what the early childhood block grant does today, and let them figure out how to deal. I'm happy to go into other issues of the law, but do you have a follow-up question?
That's helpful. I was curious about, knowing that it's on the table now, how you might envision it differently, given the way they're approaching it. So that's helpful.
Yeah, no, and look, there are never any permanent decisions in Washington, D.C. And part of what the Defense for Freedom Institute will do, or DeFi will do, is to work to make sure through the rules and regulations that the federal government's intrusion into this space is as limited as possible. So just know that as part of our agenda going forward.
So let's talk about Head Start. As long as we're on the topic of early childhood education, we have had a program in early childhood education that's focused on the most needy segment of our society since 1965. And what can we learn from that experience and that was totally federally funded. Here's an example of a totally federally funded program that's been around for a long period of time in exactly this space. So what can we learn from that experience?
So one comment first, Paul, it's actually surprising to me that the Head Start community hasn't stood up and said that early childhood plan is bad for us. I don't see them surviving this legislation for very long. Maybe there's been a deal that they get a carve out, but it does not look that way to me. There are some important distinctions here. This bill is universal pre-K, and Head Start was focused on our neediest families. And that is something that I understand why the Democrats are going that way, but you might argue that the Head Start program was far more important than universal pre-K. The program has not been as successful as we'd like it to be. It has helped get students ready for school, but it has, I think of the people who are eligible, only about a third participate. That raises questions for me about whether it is indeed an effective model. Why isn't it meeting the needs of its communities? I believe, again, if you empowered states to do this work, even by giving them money, they might figure out what's going wrong there. And there are other issues that, as much as they make progress in Head Start, those are washed away as soon as they hit the public education system. So by the time they're in third or fourth grade, all the gains, the Head Start they got, seem to disappear. Again, that's something we should look at. And I don't think we can do it at the federal level. I think that's something, again, where you have to empower local people to find an answer to it.
Yeah, there is this study that Congress mandated that was conducted a few years back, and they found that all the gains from Head Start disappeared by third grade, according to this study. So that's very consistent with what you say. The thing that worries me about attaching early childhood to the school system as it exists today is that's very likely to perpetuate the great inequalities that exist in our current system. You might have wonderful preschool programs in exclusive suburbs where you have the resources to create a marvelous program, but at the same time, not have anything nearly adequate in parts of the country where the need is the greatest. So isn't this the biggest problem with universal pre-K, is that it's just going to be serving the people who are least in need of it?
Oh, well, exactly. And you could also add to that it will be done in the most expensive way possible. I also, there is a larger issue here, Paul. They're saying universal pre-K. I very much worry that they're talking about compulsory pre-K. They can't say that at the federal level, but why else are you saying everybody should be in pre-K before you eventually say they need to be? There are a lot of benefits of early childhood, but I'm also pretty confident that it can be provided outside of the government school system. And so I worry about that. So literally, we're creating a K-12 system that begins at age 3. And we know there are people who would like to begin public education at age 0. That is literally their slogan. So I worry about that. And, you and I have had other conversations about this. we need to be empowering families to be the primary educator of their children. And we seem with every generation to be eroding that. And this would just be another step in that direction.
So there is the argument that is made that children are young people today, when they have children, bear an enormous expense. And the cost of raising a child is escalating all the time. And parents need help. It's not so easy to find the resources at that point in your life to do all the things for your children that you would like to do, no matter how committed a parent you are. So isn't this something that can help meet the needs of parents? I think that's one of the reasons why this is such a popular idea out there, and why, despite all the cuts that are being made in the current proposal on other matters, this particular policy is surviving all the reanalyses that are going on now on Capitol Hill.
Well, look, it's totally true. And you have, we should talk about the single parent who has an essential job and how they are putting things together right now, particularly even with a K-12 system that only works from 8 in the morning until 2 o'clock in the afternoon, right? There's a lot that people have to cobble together. One of the solutions, which I'm generally favorable toward, is the childhood tax credit, right? Where is a refundable credit that is now going to families to help. The estimates that this might cut poverty in half, that's all good, right? This is better for kids. What I worry about is that people think it's mechanical. Like, oh, good, we'll give them money, then they won't be officially in poverty, and the life outcomes of those kids will be better. And I just want to put on the table, it is a lot more complicated than that. We need to do a lot more around our school systems and our in the provision of education in this country to actually solve that problem. So
I want
more
you
editorial.
to put in your questions. I see we have here a question on block grants from Ira Stoll. Ira, would you like to pose the question yourself?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can, Ira.
All right. Hi, Jim. Thanks for doing this. So I was just saying, like, traditionally when someone suggests block granting for the states, it came up with welfare reform. The left complains that the state capitals are notoriously corrupt, and even more so now with the collapse of local journalism, and that the states haven't exactly been leading the way on civil rights without pushes from Washington. Like they say, if you think public employee unions are influential in Washington, try Sacramento. And then the right says, what's so magical about giving the money a round trip through Washington before it gets spent? If the states want to spend money, let them do it on their own. So my question is, how would you object to those two objections to the block grant to the states approach that you are suggesting?
Yeah. So I find it at least ironic that the left would be criticizing the power and influence of the labor unions in Sacramento. I'm a Californian, and we'll just take note of that. Look, the civil rights issue is an outlier that is worth having a whole discussion around, because that was one local failure that led to a national debate about whether the federal government should start imposing civil rights on communities that simply did not want it, right? And it took a few decades of discussion before the country finally came around and passed the great civil rights laws of the 1960s. That might include an ESEA, by the way. But that was a torturous period for the government, and it required a national debate and a lot of activism for people to finally agree that is an area where the federal government needs to be involved. I think that consensus that the federal government needs to be involved in enforcing civil rights persists today. There are groups that are trying to redefine what that consensus is. I think that's healthy for America to go through whether we move beyond that consensus from the 60s. And to summarize what that meant is that we should judge people by their character and not by the color of their skin. And we should have non-discrimination in this country. So I would argue that that is an outlier, particularly in this context, because I imagine that that role of the federal government will continue. The issue that somehow state governments are more corrupt than Washington, D.C., I suppose it depends on what you mean by corrupt. I spent a lot of time in New Orleans, and prior to the storm Katrina, you could easily say that that school district was corrupt. It was corrupt financially and academically. That has changed over time, and for the better, for students, for everyone. I'm sorry to pick on New Orleans, but there are other places of, centers of corruption around the country. I get that. But if you're talking about corruption in terms of incentives, I think the incentives in Washington, parallel the corrupting influences around the rest of the country. And it has the added problem of being one step removed from the local voter constituent. And so on balance, I think it's much stronger to put power in the hands of states versus the federal government.
So once again, let me invite you all to pose your questions. Let me ask you this question, Jim. You talk about the fact that much more money is being spent on education today than in the past, but the cost of everything goes up, especially in service industries, because you can't get the same efficiencies in the delivery of services that you can get in the manufacturing of goods or in other areas where technology has been able to accelerate productivity. So if you look at the salaries of people in education, take teacher salaries, for example, they have gone up over the years, but it's not the case that their salaries have climbed more than everybody else's salary. So you're always going to have a more expensive educational system as long as you have a growing economy, a more productive economy. It's just part of the package.
Yeah, I'm not sure that justifies a 20-fold increase, though, Paul. That's, but yes, you're absolutely right. One of the mysteries sort of in education is that you could have a 20-fold increase in revenue and expenditures, and yet teacher salaries have barely kept up with the rate of inflation. By the way, I'm not meaning to say that teachers are vastly underpaid. In California, the average teacher makes about $80,000, according to the NEA. And, that is a good middle class income, particularly when you think about working 200 days a year versus the 250 that the average American does. But all that to say that, you have not seen the dramatic improvements in teacher salaries. And that may be a mystery until you start looking at how they are being staffed, the districts. The number of adults now per child is several multiples behind what it was even 20 years ago. So there's a lot more administrative and support staff going into the system, each of whom gets paid a salary, many of whom pay union dues. And so those seem to be what's adding to the cost. And I think all of us would like us to pull back and say, wow, how many of those people are actually improving student outcomes? I understand they're getting good jobs, and it's important to provide jobs in this economy, but we need to be tying things more And I think what that would mean is paying excellent teachers far more than they're getting paid now, and removing the teachers who are chronically ineffective.
So the public seems to want a federal fiscal role. When the Education Next survey asked the public, how much do you think should come from the local government? How much should come from the state government? How much from the federal government? And Education Next did this on two separate occasions over a period of time. They got essentially the same answer both times. 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 should come from each level of government. And now, as you pointed out, or at least before COVID, it was more like 7% or 10% from the federal government, as compared to, say, 50% or nearly 50% from the other two levels of government. So isn't a larger fiscal role for the federal government quite in line with what the public is asking?
So Paul, I really try and follow your polling, and I'm sorry, I was not aware of that. I find it interesting. I also find that, like so much polling, it's not informed by public debate. I think it would be natural for somebody who didn't know anything about this subject to simply say, sure, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. I'm hoping that as we raise the conversation about how much should actually come from the federal government and some of the downsides of that, that we'd see those figures shift. And in fact, I'll use it as a benchmark for our team.
Well, that would be interesting if you did in fact find a shift in the future, because we haven't seen that number shift particularly, and it may be simply because people are not well enough informed about the way in which the system has evolved over time. So we have a question here from Valentina Tovar. Valentina, do you want to pose the question?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Jim, for being with us. As a former teacher and current student at the Graduate School of Education, taking a lot of classes about education policy and seeing the balance of, kind of what you mentioned, the role of at the federal level and the role of districts and schools and states. And I guess my question is, if we are diverting from federal impact and the large hand that it has grown to be, how do we assure that kids are getting the education that they deserve? And how do we make sure that that's happening at a state or district level when ultimately schools are failing kids? And we see these rates of graduation, and we see this literacy. So how do we make sure that low income kids of color are being provided, if it is school choice, equitably, or if it is Head Start, equitably, to be successful?
Yeah.
Wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I can only give you my thoughts on this one because we don't know the answer. We do know that we were failing too many students, particularly students of color from low-income communities, before the federal involvement. What we also know is that after a fairly intense federal involvement through NCLB and other things, it didn't help that much. So we don't have an example yet of how we do that well at a system level. We do have lots of examples at the local level. You can point to several charter schools that have closed the achievement gap, for example, who've gotten much better outcomes through college. And that's why it is a hypothesis, Valentina. My hypothesis is we're going to be more successful if we empower the educators, the leaders on the ground in communities to solve these problems. Because I just simply don't think it can be done from Washington, D.C. And admittedly, I could be wrong, but I think it's worth a try given the expensive failure that the federal government has turned out to be.
Yeah, could I?
Yeah,
sorry,
go
could I
ahead,
ask?
Valentina. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that is such a great point of, being a teacher, I former teacher, I totally agree on like the empowerment of teachers, and they are ultimately the deciding factor in kids getting a great education or not, or one of the deciding factors. I guess my follow-up question to that is like, how do we assure that those teachers are being empowered? And charter schools have had really great results, but they're working teachers longer hours and paying them less than your typical public school. So if we want those results at a local level, at a district level, at a state level, how are we, I guess, empowering those states? Or I'm just like not sure how do we tangibly do that, you know?
Yeah, and first of all, Valentina, I want to sort of challenge that charter school teachers are getting paid less. You know, they're in a competitive market. Often that market is determined by the school district. They are often younger, and as a result get paid less because they're earlier in their careers, and that sort of distorts the studies on this. Here's what I would, and there's another point I wanted to make, first of all. Betsy DeVos often talked about education freedom. She really meant that as much for teachers as for families. And we did not accentuate that enough. And what we are arguing as reformers now is that we have to figure out a way to empower teachers. I've never met an excellent teacher who was afraid of hard work. And so when I hear like, oh, well, we can't do that because you work them harder in charter schools, that's just not my experience of teachers. Like the great ones go the extra mile, 300 days a year, 365 days a year for their kids. And so I'm not afraid of asking that of the profession. I think that's what a profession would do. And I imagine that there are lots of teachers out there that would respond to that call.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jim. I think for me as a teacher, that was one of those that went the extra mile, having it take a toll on your like mental health and the work that you do. It's like you think it's absolutely worth it for the kids, but at the same time, teachers should not be expected to do that without being paid what they deserve for that role. So it's a hard balance of absolutely teachers should work hard and earn that place, and we should definitely get rid of ineffective teachers. But how do we retain those teachers in the schools that need it the most, for sure? But thank you for your thoughts.
Look, and salaries are part of the answer. I mean, you know, I think Michelle Rhee proved in Washington, D.C. that you can pay more effective teachers more, particularly those that are taking on the harder assignments. More money doesn't solve all of the mental health and stress problems of educators. This is not an area of my expertise, but I certainly think that if people were focused on that, rather than limiting the job, then we could solve it, just as they have in every other sector in this
For
economy.
sure.
Look,
Yeah.
look at healthcare, you can look at, you get the point.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thank you so much for your thoughts, Jim. I appreciate you engaging in the conversation.
Thanks.
So we have a question here from Daniel Curtis, who says that special education costs have gone up, and he wants to discuss that with you. Daniel, do you want to pose your question?
Yes. First, thank you so much for being with us, Jim. And so in the last year or so, I've been looking a lot at special education funding. And one thing I've noticed is that in the last 10 years or so, special education costs have increased a lot. In a lot of states, including Connecticut, where most of my research focused, those costs have been funded more and more from local sources. And, you know, this has strained district budgets, and many have called on federal government to increase their IDEA contributions to help relieve districts of this budgetary pressure. And so I'm wondering, what are some alternative methods that you would propose to support districts in providing special education and reduce this budgetary strain that has been placed?
Yeah. So 2 points around, and Daniel, you clearly know this subject well, so correct me about any misimpressions I have. First of all, look, during the DeVos years, we held the budget. We tried to hold the budget down. The one area where we thought we should raise the budget was in special education. We believe the whole system needs to be more individualized. And I think the the industrial model does not know how to do that without a great deal of brute power and cost. Adding to that, so part of my answer there is like, there are cheaper ways to do this. And we are not even exploring those because the industrial model has approached special ed the way they have. Add on top of that, Daniel, the enormous litigation that I was referencing. You know, that does add a lot of costs. And anybody who works in the school district and the special ed department will tell you about how, you know, the cost of all of that and how it often leads to non-public school placements, which are much higher cost than having the traditional district provided. So all of that, I think, is conspiring to raise the costs. And I think rather than to say, well, we can't change the system, that's the way it is, I think we should be looking at ways to reduce the litigation costs and to provide the services in a way that is both individualized, more effective, and less costly.
So Daniel, you have a follow-up?
Yes, and I'm kind of curious as to, are there any specific reforms to like the due process terms and idea that the DeVos administration, you know, was looking at?
Not this was not my area of expertise. I don't know, Daniel. I'm just sure there are a lot of creative people who, if given the task, could figure it out. I may have too much faith in people there, but they're not even allowed to have the discussion because the system does the system thing, right? And they're not taking a step back and rethinking how they should approach it.
Thank you.
I think our time is about up here. So Jim, thank you very much for your perceptive comments on the federal role and your challenges to all of us to rethink and reassess exactly how we can best create a system that works for children. So thank you all for joining us today. Our seminar series continues next time, which is November 18th, this Thursday, 2 weeks from now. It'll be at the same time. And so log back on to learn more about the charter school sector and what the future holds. So thank you very much, Jim, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Take care.
Goodbye.